The small town of Cedar Ridge, nestled in the heart of the American Midwest, was a place where time seemed to stand still. Its streets, lined with quaint shops and weathered oak trees, exuded a quiet charm that belied the simmering tensions beneath the surface. Cedar Ridge was a town divided not by geography, but by the invisible lines of race and privilege. It was a place where the past clung stubbornly to the present, where the echoes of old prejudices reverberated through the lives of its residents. At the center of this tension was John Carter, a 42-year-old police officer with a reputation that preceded him. Carter was a man who wore his badge like a shield, using it to justify his actions and silence his critics. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that had hardened over the years into a mask of indifference. His icy blue eyes seemed to see the world in black and white, both literally and figuratively. To many in Cedar Ridge, Carter was a symbol of authority. To others, he was a reminder of a system that had failed them time and time again. Carter's disdain for the town's black community was no secret. He had been involved in numerous incidents over the years, traffic stops that escalated unnecessarily, confrontations that turned violent, and accusations of racial profiling that were swept under the rug. Yet, despite the complaints and the occasional internal investigation, Carter remained on the force. His colleagues either shared his views or were too afraid to speak out against him. The police department, like the town itself, was a microcosm of a larger, more insidious problem. On the other side of this divide stood General James Williams, a man who had spent his life breaking barriers and defying expectations. Williams was a towering figure in every sense of the word. A decorated military officer, he had served multiple tours overseas, earning the respect of his peers and the admiration of his community. He was a man of principle, a leader who believed in the power of unity and the importance of standing up for what was right. His deep, resonant voice and commanding presence made him a natural leader, someone people looked to in times of crisis. Williams had returned to Cedar Ridge after retiring from the military, hoping to spend his remaining years in peace. But peace was a luxury that eluded him. He had become a vocal advocate for racial justice, using his platform to speak out against the systemic inequalities that plagued the town. His efforts had earned him both praise and enemies. To the black community, he was a hero. To men like John Carter, he was a threat. The news of General Williams' passing sent shockwaves through Cedar Ridge. He had succumbed to a long battle with cancer, leaving behind a legacy that would not soon be forgotten. His funeral was set to be a grand affair, a testament to the impact he had made on so many lives. People from all walks of life were expected to attend: military officials, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who had been touched by his kindness and courage. The Williams family, though grieving, was determined to honor his memory with dignity. His wife, Evelyn, a woman of quiet strength, had spent the days leading up to the funeral making arrangements and receiving condolences. Their daughter, Maya, a fierce and outspoken activist in her own right, had taken on the role of organizing the event. She wanted it to be a celebration of her father's life, a reminder of the values he had fought for. As the day of the funeral approached, the town braced itself for what was to come. The air was thick with anticipation, a mixture of sorrow and unease. For many, it was a chance to pay their respects to a man who had given so much. For others, it was a reminder of the divisions that still existed, the wounds that had yet to heal. John Carter, meanwhile, had been assigned to provide security for the funeral. It was a decision that had raised eyebrows among his colleagues, but one that had been made without much thought. Carter had a way of inserting himself into situations where he wasn't needed, and this was no exception. He saw the assignment as an opportunity to assert his authority, to remind everyone who was in charge. As he stood at the edge of the cemetery, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, Carter scanned the crowd with a cold, calculating gaze. He didn't see mourners or loved ones. He saw potential threats, faces that didn't belong. His mind was already racing, anticipating the worst. To him, the funeral was not a time for reflection or remembrance. It was a battleground, and he was ready for war. Little did he know, the events that were about to unfold would change everything. For him, for the town, and for the legacy of General James Williams. The stage was set, the players in place. All that was left was for the curtain to rise. The morning of General James Williams' funeral dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that seemed almost too perfect, as if nature itself was paying its respects. The cemetery, a sprawling expanse of green dotted with weathered headstones and ancient oaks, was bathed in golden sunlight. A gentle breeze carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, mingling with the somber notes of a distant trumpet playing taps. The crowd that gathered was as diverse as the life General Williams had lived. Military personnel in full-dress uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder with community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens. The air was thick with emotion, grief, gratitude, and an unspoken determination to honor the man who had meant so much to so many. Evelyn Williams, dressed in a simple black dress, stood at the front of the gathering, her face a mask of quiet strength. Beside her was Maya, her eyes red-rimmed but unwavering, clutching a folded American flag to her chest. The coffin, draped in the stars and stripes, rested on a platform at the center of the gathering, a stark reminder of the finality of death. The service began with a eulogy from a retired colonel who had served alongside General Williams. His voice trembled as he spoke of Williams' courage, his integrity, and his unwavering commitment to justice. James Williams was not just a soldier, he said, his words echoing across the silent crowd. He was a beacon of hope, a man who believed in the power of unity and the importance of standing up for what is right. His legacy will live on in all of us. As the eulogy concluded, a young soldier stepped forward to perform a ceremonial salute. The sharp crack of the rifle volley echoed through the cemetery, followed by the haunting strains of taps. It was a moment of profound solemnity, a collective pause to honor a life well lived. But the tranquility of the moment was shattered by a sudden commotion at the edge of the crowd. John Carter, his face flushed and his eyes wild, was pushing his way through the mourners, his hand resting ominously on the holster of his gun. His presence was like a storm cloud descending on a sunny day, casting a shadow over the proceedings. "What's going on here?" Carter barked, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Who authorized this gathering?" The crowd turned to him, a mixture of confusion and anger on their faces. Maya stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with fury. "This is my father's funeral," she said, her eyes blazing. "You have no right to disrupt it." Carter ignored her, his gaze locking onto a young black soldier who was standing near the coffin, his hands clasped in front of him. The soldier, a private named Marcus Johnson, had been one of General Williams' protégés. He had come to pay his respects, to honor the man who had inspired him to serve his country. "You," Carter said, pointing a finger at Marcus, "step away from the coffin. Now." Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting to Maya and the other mourners. "I'm just here to pay my respects," he said, his voice calm but firm. Carter's hand moved to his gun, his fingers tightening around the grip. "I said step away," he repeated, his voice rising. "You're acting suspiciously. I won't hesitate to use force if necessary." The crowd erupted in murmurs of disbelief and anger. Maya stepped between Carter and Marcus, her hands raised in a gesture of defiance. "You have no right to do this," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "This is my father's funeral. You're out of line." But Carter was beyond reason. His face was a mask of determination, his eyes locked on Marcus as if he were a threat to be neutralized. In one swift motion, he drew his gun and pointed it at Marcus, the barrel gleaming in the sunlight. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the air out of the cemetery. Marcus froze, his hands instinctively rising in surrender. "I'm not a threat," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just let me honor my general." Carter's finger hovered over the trigger, his breathing heavy and erratic. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself had stopped, the world holding its breath in anticipation of what would happen next. Then, from the crowd, a voice rang out, a deep, commanding voice that cut through the tension like a knife. "Put the gun down, Carter. All eyes turned to the source of the voice. It was Colonel Robert Hayes, a retired officer and close friend of General Williams. Hayes stepped forward, his face a mask of fury. "This is a funeral, not a battlefield," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "You're dishonoring the memory of a great man. Put the gun down." For a moment, Carter hesitated, his eyes flickering between Hayes and Marcus. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun, his face a mixture of defiance and shame. The crowd exhaled, the tension dissipating like a storm cloud passing overhead. But the damage had been done. The sanctity of the funeral had been violated, the memory of General Williams tarnished by the actions of one man. As Carter was led away by his colleagues, the crowd turned their attention back to the coffin, their grief mingling with a newfound determination to fight for the justice that General Williams had always believed in. The incident would become a turning point, a moment that would galvanize the community and set in motion a chain of events that would change Cedar Ridge forever. But for now, the mourners stood in silence, their hearts heavy with loss and their minds filled with questions. The funeral of General James Williams had become more than a farewell. It had become a call to action. The news of what had happened at General James Williams' funeral spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. By the time the sun set that evening, the town was buzzing with outrage, disbelief, and a simmering sense of injustice. The incident had been captured on multiple smartphones, and the footage, showing John Carter, a uniformed police officer, pointing his gun at a young black soldier during a funeral, was already making its way across social media. The hashtag Justice for Williams began trending within hours, drawing national attention to the small Midwestern town. In the Williams household, the mood was one of quiet determination. Evelyn and Maya sat in the living room, surrounded by friends and family, as the television played a loop of news coverage. The images of Carter's confrontation with Marcus Johnson were replayed over and over, each time reigniting the anger and pain that had gripped the community. "We can't let this go," Maya said, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. "Dad spent his life fighting for justice. We owe it to him to keep fighting." Evelyn nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He would have wanted us to stand up," she said softly. "But we need to do it the right way. We need to make sure his legacy isn't overshadowed by this madness." Meanwhile, Marcus Johnson found himself thrust into the spotlight. A quiet and unassuming young man, he had never sought attention or recognition. But now, he was being hailed as a symbol of resilience and courage. Reporters camped outside his apartment, eager to hear his side of the story. Community leaders reached out, offering their support and urging him to speak out. Marcus, however, was struggling to process what had happened. The image of Carter's gun pointed at him, the cold, unyielding look in the officer's eyes. It haunted him. He had served his country, risked his life overseas, only to come home and face a different kind of battle. The irony was not lost on him. "I just wanted to honor General Williams," he told a reporter during a brief interview. "He was my mentor, my hero. I never thought something like this would happen." The incident also sparked a wave of protests in Cedar Ridge. By the next morning, hundreds of people had gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Black Lives Matter" and "Justice for General Williams." The crowd was a mix of races and ages, a testament to the impact Williams had had on the community. Chants of "No justice, no peace" echoed through the streets, punctuated by the occasional roar of a passing car horn in solidarity. The police department, caught off guard by the intensity of the backlash, scrambled to respond. Chief Daniel Harris, a gruff and no-nonsense man in his late 50s, held a press conference in an attempt to quell the growing unrest. Standing at a podium flanked by American flags, he addressed the crowd of reporters with a carefully prepared statement. "The actions of Officer John Carter do not reflect the values of the Cedar Ridge Police Department," Harris said, his voice steady but his face betraying his discomfort. "We take these allegations very seriously and have launched an internal investigation. We are committed to ensuring that justice is served." His words did little to appease the crowd. "Internal investigation?" someone shouted from the back of the room. That's code for sweeping it under the rug. The tension in the room was palpable, and Harris knew he was walking a tightrope. He had always prided himself on maintaining order, on keeping Cedar Ridge safe. But now he was facing a crisis that threatened to tear the town apart. Behind the scenes, the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. The district attorney's office announced that it would be reviewing the case, and there were calls for Carter to be charged with assault and civil rights violations. Civil rights organizations, including the NAACP, pledged their support to the Williams family and Marcus, vowing to ensure that the case received the attention it deserved. For John Carter, the fallout was swift and unrelenting. He was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, but that did little to shield him from the public's wrath. His home was vandalized, his family harassed. He became a pariah, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. But Carter was unrepentant. In a series of interviews with right-wing media outlets, he defended his actions, claiming that he had been doing his job and that Marcus Johnson had been acting suspiciously. His words only fueled the anger, further polarizing an already divided community. As the days turned into weeks, the incident at General Williams' funeral became a rallying cry for change. Town hall meetings were held, where residents demanded accountability and reform. The Williams family, along with Marcus, became the faces of a movement that extended far beyond Cedar Ridge. Their story was featured in national news outlets, sparking conversations about police brutality, systemic racism, and the need for meaningful change. But amidst the outrage and the calls for justice, there was also a sense of hope. The community, though fractured, was coming together in a way it never had before. People who had never spoken out before were finding their voices, standing up for what they believed in. General Williams' legacy, far from being tarnished, was being amplified, a reminder of the power of courage, integrity, and the fight for justice. As Maya stood on the steps of the courthouse, addressing a crowd of supporters, she felt her father's presence beside her. "This isn't just about one man," she said, her voice strong and clear. "This is about all of us. It's about the world we want to live in, the world my father fought for. We won't stop until we see real change." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in unison. For the first time in a long time, Cedar Ridge felt alive, united by a common purpose. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were ready to walk it together. The trial of John Carter began on a cold, gray morning in early December. The courthouse, a stately brick building in the center of Cedar Ridge, was surrounded by a throng of reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers. The case had captured the nation's attention, and the media circus that accompanied it was unlike anything the small town had ever seen. Satellite trucks lined the streets, their antennas pointed skyward, while journalists jostled for position, microphones and cameras at the ready. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The gallery was packed with spectators, their faces a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Evelyn and Maya Williams sat in the front row, their hands clasped tightly together. Marcus Johnson, dressed in a crisp suit, sat a few seats away, his expression stoic but his eyes betraying the weight of the moment. Across the aisle, John Carter sat at the defense table, his face impassive, his posture rigid. He was flanked by his attorney, a slick, silver-haired man named Richard Holloway, who had built a reputation for defending controversial clients. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rachel, was determined to make an example of Carter. Rachel, a sharp and tenacious lawyer with a reputation for holding law enforcement accountable, had spent weeks preparing for the trial. She knew the case was about more than just one officer's actions. It was about sending a message that no one was above the law. As the trial got underway, the prosecution laid out its case with precision and care. Rachel called a series of witnesses, each one painting a damning picture of Carter's behavior. Fellow officers testified about his history of aggressive and racially charged conduct, describing incidents that had been brushed aside or ignored. Community members recounted their own encounters with Carter, their voices trembling with anger and fear. But the most powerful testimony came from Marcus Johnson. Taking the stand, Marcus recounted the events of the funeral in vivid detail, his voice steady but his hands clenched into fists. "I was there to honor General Williams," he said, his eyes locking with Carter's. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't a threat. But he treated me like a criminal. He pointed a gun at me, in front of all those people, like my life didn't matter." The courtroom was silent as Marcus spoke, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Even Carter, who had maintained a stoic demeanor throughout the trial, seemed to flinch under the intensity of Marcus's gaze. Rachel then turned her attention to the broader implications of Carter's actions. She presented evidence of systemic issues within the Cedar Ridge Police Department, including internal memos and emails that showed a pattern of ignoring complaints about racial profiling and excessive force. "This isn't just about one bad apple," she told the jury during her opening statement. "This is about a culture of impunity, a system that has failed to protect the very people it's supposed to serve." The defense, however, was not about to go down without a fight. Holloway argued that Carter had been acting in the line of duty, that he had perceived a potential threat and responded accordingly. He painted Marcus as a suspicious figure who had been acting erratically at the funeral, though his claims were quickly dismantled under cross-examination. Holloway also attempted to shift the focus away from Carter's actions, instead framing the trial as an attack on law enforcement as a whole. "This case isn't about justice," he declared during his closing argument. "It's about politics. It's about vilifying a man who dedicated his life to protecting this community." But the defense's arguments fell flat. The evidence against Carter was overwhelming, and the prosecution's case was airtight. As the trial drew to a close, it became clear that the jury was leaning toward a guilty verdict. The final blow came when the prosecution played the video footage of the incident. The grainy, shaky images showed Carter advancing on Marcus, his gun drawn, his face twisted in anger. The audio captured his harsh commands, the gasps of the crowd, and the chilling moment when he pointed the weapon at Marcus. It was a moment that left no room for doubt, no room for interpretation. As the video played, Carter's mask of indifference began to crack. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of what he had done, the lives he had shattered, the trust he had betrayed. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom was electric with tension. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a solemn expression, stood and read the verdict aloud. Guilty on all counts. The gallery erupted in a mixture of cheers and tears. Evelyn and Maya embraced, their relief palpable. Marcus sat quietly, his head bowed, as if the weight of the past few months had finally been lifted. Carter, meanwhile, sat motionless, his face pale, his hands trembling. As the judge handed down the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, the courtroom fell silent. Carter was led away in handcuffs. His head hung low, his once imposing figure now diminished. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, their voices raised in celebration and defiance. Maya stepped up to a makeshift podium, her eyes shining with tears but her voice strong and clear. "This is just the beginning," she said, her words carrying the weight of her father's legacy. "We've taken a step toward justice, but the fight isn't over. We'll keep pushing, keep fighting, until no one has to go through what we went through." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the streets of Cedar Ridge. For the first time in a long time, there was a sense of hope, a belief that change was possible. The trial of John Carter had been a turning point, a moment of reckoning for a town and a nation, grappling with its past and striving for a better future. The sentencing of John Carter marked the end of a chapter, but it was far from the end of the story. For Cedar Ridge, the trial had been a crucible, a moment of reckoning that laid bare the town's deepest wounds and forced its residents to confront uncomfortable truths. In the months that followed, the community grappled with the fallout, striving to heal and rebuild while honoring the legacy of General James Williams. For Evelyn and Maya Williams, life after the trial was a mix of relief and reflection. The verdict had brought a measure of closure, but it could never fill the void left by James's absence. Evelyn found solace in her work with local charities, channeling her grief into efforts to support families affected by racial injustice. She became a quiet but powerful advocate for change, her gentle demeanor belying a steely resolve. Maya, on the other hand, threw herself into activism with a fervor that mirrored her father's. She traveled the country, speaking at rallies and conferences, her voice a clarion call for justice and equality. She worked tirelessly to keep her father's memory alive, establishing the James Williams Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to combating systemic racism and supporting marginalized communities. The foundation quickly gained traction, attracting donations and volunteers from across the nation. Marcus Johnson, too, found a new sense of purpose in the wake of the trial. Though he had never sought the spotlight, he embraced his role as a symbol of resilience and courage. He partnered with Maya to launch the foundation's first major initiative, a program aimed at providing mentorship and resources to young Black men and women in underserved communities. General Williams believed in us, Marcus said during the program's launch event. He saw our potential even when others didn't. It's up to us to carry that torch, to make sure his legacy lives on. The Cedar Ridge Police Department, meanwhile, underwent a period of intense scrutiny and reform. Chief Daniel Harris, who had initially resisted calls for change, was forced to step down after a series of damning reports exposed the department's culture of impunity. His replacement, a progressive and reform-minded officer named Lisa Morales, made it her mission to rebuild trust between the police and the community. She implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation and implicit bias, established a civilian review board, and prioritized transparency and accountability. The changes were slow and often met with resistance, but they were undeniably transformative. Over time, the relationship between the police and the community began to heal, though the scars of the past remained. For many, the reforms were a testament to the power of collective action, a reminder that change was possible when people came together to demand it. As for John Carter, life behind bars was a stark contrast to the power and privilege he had once wielded. In prison, he was just another inmate, stripped of his badge and his authority. He spent his days in relative isolation, shunned by other prisoners and haunted by the choices that had led him there. In rare interviews, he expressed regret, not for his actions, but for the consequences they had brought upon him. "I was just doing my job," he insisted, his words ringing hollow. "I never thought it would come to this." But for the people of Cedar Ridge, Carter's fate was a reminder of the importance of accountability. His downfall was not just a personal tragedy, but a symbol of a system that had been held to account, however imperfectly. It was a small but significant victory in the ongoing fight for justice. Years passed, and the town continued to evolve. The protests and rallies that had once filled the streets gave way to quieter, more sustained efforts to create lasting change. The James Williams Foundation flourished, its programs touching countless lives and inspiring similar initiatives across the country. Cedar Ridge became a model for other communities grappling with issues of race and justice, a testament to the power of resilience and hope. On the anniversary of General Williams' death, the town gathered once more at the cemetery. The oak trees that lined the path to his grave had grown taller, their branches stretching toward the sky as if in tribute. The crowd was smaller than it had been at the funeral, but no less heartfelt. Evelyn and Maya stood at the head of the gathering, their faces etched with both sorrow and pride. "My father believed in the power of unity," Maya said, her voice carrying across the quiet crowd. "He believed that we were stronger together, that we could overcome anything if we stood side by side. Today, as we honor his memory, let's also honor his vision. Let's keep fighting for the world he believed in. A world where justice isn't just a dream, but a reality." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the cemetery, the crowd began to disperse. But the sense of purpose and determination lingered, a quiet but powerful force that would carry them forward. General James Williams was gone, but his legacy lived on in the work of his family, in the reforms that had reshaped his town, and in the hearts of all those who had been touched by his courage and conviction. The story of Cedar Ridge was far from over, but it was a story of hope, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, light could prevail. And as long as there were people willing to fight for justice, the legacy of General James Williams would never be forgotten.